Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. We mentioned this in our last lesson, but now we're going to dive deep into this topic. So our essential question is, how did the Soviet Union enforce communist policies on Eastern European and Balkan nations? So let's look at the Soviet Union itself. Following World War II, the USSR had been devastated and needed to recover. I mean, cities completely demolished, 20 million people killed. It was rough. Now, to recover, Stalin imposes some policies which really focus on exporting raw materials and manufactured goods, particularly heavy industry goods, to build up the economy while giving very little to the Soviet workers. So the idea is, we make a lot of money and we don't spend a lot of money on the people. This policy really does work in achieving its goals. The Soviet economy recovers. The industry rebuilds. By 1950, their production is 40% higher than it was before the war, which is remarkable considering Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, three of their biggest cities were completely destroyed during this war, particularly Leningrad and Stalingrad. To get by 1950 production higher than it was before, it really was quite an achievement. The Soviet people, however, didn't feel a lot of that gain because, again, they didn't have access to any of the increased wealth. That wealth went to the government itself to be spent on large government military projects. So the reign of Stalin, we're going to be looking at this guy right here. Stalin was unswayed by the material desires of his people. His people wanted more. Who cares? I'm in charge. They don't have a say. He was an absolute dictator and a guy that many people just were terrified of. In 1946, he ordered all scientific and literary work done within the Soviet Union needed to be directed towards serving the needs of the state. So if you were doing scientific research, it was the science that was going to benefit the Soviet Union. If you were producing written work, plays, books, poems, whatever, it had to be in service of the state and elevating the state. Anybody who wanted to work independently and to do work that didn't align with Soviet needs, they were simply purged, which could mean just executed. Could also mean that they were sent to work camps in Siberia that was a death sentence too. It was just a longer one. So it was really brutal. People knew this, and so very few people went against Stalin's wishes. They lived in fear of this man until his death in 1953, possibly murdered. He could very well have been poisoned by members of the Communist Party itself. All right, so in comes the Khrushchev era. After this transitional period, Nikita Khrushchev gains power in 1953. Now, Khrushchev begins a process of de-Stalinization and really condemns most of Stalin's most brutal tactics. He wants to say, this is a break with the past. The Soviet Union is not this brutal dictatorship that Stalin turned us into. We are something better than that. Khrushchev was very popular with the people for this. He was also popular because he slightly increased the amount of consumer goods that were available within the Soviet Union. But he was also very unpopular with top communists. And he was unpopular because he had a lot of foreign policy blunders and foreign policy failures. The biggest example was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he believed he could get away with putting Soviet missiles in Cuba, right next to the United States. This provoked a response from the United States that should have been foreseeable. And when the United States responded, Khrushchev backed down. And this was seen by the top communists as a major misstep. And this ultimately results in Khrushchev being removed from power. He's forced to retire in 1964. So Eastern Europe. In the final months of World War II, Soviet armies took control of the previously Nazi-occupied areas of Eastern Europe. They wanted to surround themselves with friendly nations, right? So we have Russia. the Soviet nations surrounding them because they want to be surrounded by friendly nations, and then the Soviet satellite states surrounding them because they want the Soviet Union to be surrounded by friendly nations, and the idea that they're going to keep pushing out and pushing out and pushing out to make sure that communist nations are always surrounded by communist nations. And the logical end of that is the indefinite spread of communism. So they use this policy, this mentality, to take control of most of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, with the notable exception of Yugoslavia, Greece, and Albania. We mentioned Greece before in a previous lesson, and how Greece was maintained as non-communist due to Western intervention. Yugoslavia becomes this whole other interesting thing that we'll get into. But by 1948, the Soviet Union had imposed communist governments on all of the other Eastern European and Balkans nations. So let's look at the pattern of control here. Many nations had no government when the USSR liberated them, right? They had a government, they got defeated by the Soviet Union, or not Soviet Union, the Nazis. The Nazis put in place military or Nazi civilian leaders, but as Nazi Germany collapsed, those leaders disappeared or were captured. So there's no government left. So the Soviet Union comes in, and it's easy for them to then just set up a government. And they made sure that they had set up a communist government. Communism was forcefully imposed on these nations. One of the nations that kind of pushed back on this was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had been a multi-party democracy before the war. They hadn't been a dictatorship or a kingdom. They didn't have autocratic leaders. They were a multi-party democracy, and they really wanted to go back to it. However, it was not to be. These Soviet satellite states wind up following Stalin's example. They established 5-year plans. They outlaw political parties. They suppress dissent. They form secret police. They enforce control with the military. It is going to be one-party rule, and one-party rule is always just a form of dictatorship. So Yugoslavia, as I said before, becomes this whole different thing. Yugoslavia did come to communism. They were a communist nation, but they were an independent communist nation, and they fiercely defended that status. They were okay with the Soviet Union being communist. They were happy being communist themselves. They did not want to become a satellite of the Soviet Union. And so they resisted, and they resisted successfully because of the efforts of Josip Broz, also known as Tito. Tito frames this resistance as a struggle for national freedom, that they're not going to go from German domination to Soviet domination. It's just not going to happen there. We are an independent Yugoslavia. They have no problem with the Soviets. They may even be friendly to them in some ways, so long as the Soviets let them be independent. So Tito wins this struggle, this political contest, and winds up ruling an independent Yugoslavia until his death in 1980. And it turns out Tito was really a key figure in keeping Yugoslavia together, because by 1990, Yugoslavia is breaking apart. If you're wondering why you've never heard of this place called Yugoslavia before, it's because today it is broken up into several different smaller countries based on ethnicity and religion and culture. All right, other revolts against communism. The Soviet Union ruled Eastern Europe, but they did it for their own benefit. They did not rule Eastern Germany for the benefit of Eastern Germany. They did not rule Poland to help Poland. They did this all for the benefit of the Soviet Union, leaving Eastern Europe with really bad living conditions. While Stalin lived, revolts were very rare against the Soviet Union. This is because people saw what Stalin did to his own people. If Stalin is willing to do that to his own people, he killed millions of his own people. They were not going to step out of line, because he's not going to view Polish lives as high as he does Russian lives, and it doesn't look like he views Russian lives as very valuable. So no revolts, no major ones during Stalin's life. After Stalin's death, though, some Europeans start to push for change, start to push for reform. And it starts in Poland. Poland takes a very careful, measured step and sees a bit of success with it. In 1956, Poland declares their right to follow their own socialist path. They're saying, hey, we're going to be communist. Hey, We're going to be a one-party communist nation. But we do want to do it in our own way. They importantly said they were not going to leave the Warsaw Pact. They were still in that alliance, but they just wanted to make tweaks and kind of get a little bit more control over their own nation. And there was no major response by the Soviet Union to this. So, later in 1956, Hungary tries to take things a couple steps further and overstepped what the Soviet Union was willing to tolerate. In 1956, Hungary declares themselves to be a free and independent nation, and they announce elections, free elections, where people other than communists could run for government office. It took 3 days for the Soviet Union to invade. They launched a massive attack on Hungary, tanks rolling down the streets. The Hungarian government was arrested. The leader who had declared Hungarian independence was executed. They squashed that rebellion. Now, 12 years later, Czechoslovakia tried to do something similar. They're like, hey, 12 years ago, they sent a message with Hungary. Maybe things are a little bit different now. They tried to relax freedom of speech, allow a little bit more freedom of speech, allow some foreign travel, say, hey, yeah, you can leave Czechoslovakia. Yeah, you can go to the West. It's all cool. Hey, we're even thinking about, slow, measured democratization. So maybe soon in local elections, you can choose your own leaders. Yeah, we're open to that. No, the Soviet Union is not open to that. Soviets quickly invade Czechoslovakia. We've got tanks in the street of Prague. Strict communism reinforced. There will be no more democratization, no more freedom. The Soviet Union is in charge. That's how they ruled in Eastern Europe. I hope that you learned something here. I'll catch you next time. Farewell.